from my point of view, it's pretty much over for Jews in Europe, which is a disaster. But that has not been our story here. We've never been oppressed here. It's not just a betrayal of the people in America who have our backs, which is conservatives, working class Americans, Christian Americans, but it's a betrayal of American history because it is to say we are oppressed, we have been oppressed. It is to assume a worldview that is just a complete and utter misreading of American Jewish history. You know, a bunch of college know-nothing nincompoops marching on a college campus chanting genocidal things about Jews is not oppression.
Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Batya Ungar-Sargon. Batya, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It is such a pleasure to be here with you.
It's so good to have you back on. I was just saying, it feels like ages since we last spoke, so it's really good to be able to do that now, especially since you have this brilliant new book out, which is called The Jews and the Left. I love how stark the title is. This is, it's just, this is what the book is about. There's no mystery whatsoever. Um, it's a fascinating read. For those of us who are interested in the crisis of anti-Semitism, it's really interesting read, but it also digs into American history, the changing relationship between America and Jews, between the left and Jews in particular. To me, it reads like the end of a love affair. I don't know if that's a good way to describe it, but you talk about
Definitely.
how the Jews were once at the forefront of lots of liberal causes, were once seen as good people by the left, and that has changed quite dramatically in recent years. So give us a sense of what compelled you to write this book. What made you think it was important to get this story out there?
It's so funny that you say that because I thought that the book should have a subtitle, The Jews and the Left, A Tale of Love and Betrayal, which is
Right.
basically exactly what you just
Yeah.
said. My editor thought that it would be stronger to be stark, as you pointed out. I also do have to say, I do believe probably the best two paragraphs in the book are the ones where I quote liberally and extensively from your book in the seventh chapter. The work you've done on this subject has been just so important, Brendan. I hear from Jews all the time who just worship the ground that you walk on. I wanted to write the book because I feel that in many ways our community has backed the wrong pony, and our response to anti-Semitism from the left has been the exact opposite of what it should have been. And I wanted to explain this both to Jews and to non-Jewish Americans. And what I mean by all that is the question I get asked the most by non-Jews who are conservatives, Republicans, Christians when I travel the country is, why are the Jews Democrats when the left has turned on them and we love them? Like, this is a very mysterious thing in red America because they feel that they love Israel, love the Jews, will always protect the Jews, and they feel rightly that the left does not feel that way anymore. And so this fact that Jews remain Democrats in a country in which the Democrats don't want them, like, this bears explaining. I wanted to explain that, and it became extremely urgent to me after October 7th when I saw that the organized Jewish American response from organizations like the ADL, for example, was to say, you've you've miscategorized us, right? What happened after October 7th, as you've talked about extensively, is the oppressor-oppressed binary that the left lives and breathes, right? This is their entire worldview, is there's no right versus wrong, there's no virtue versus vice, there's just oppressor oppressed. Like, that is the building blocks, that is the grammar of their thinking. In their mind, the reason that they sided with the Palestinians and with Hamas against Israel and the Jews is very obvious. It's because the Palestinians have less power, and because Hamas has less power than Israel, it is inherently virtuous, right? Because virtue belongs to the abject. This is you've Listeners to this show will be very familiar with this. Um, Now, it's obvious that this worldview was on a collision course with Jews because we're not oppressed. Like, we were never oppressed in America. We're not oppressed in Israel. We're very strong and very powerful today. they were oppressed in Europe, continue to be oppressed in Europe, are extremely embattled in Europe, and, from my point of view, it's pretty much over for Jews in Europe, which is a disaster, but that has not been our story here. We've never been oppressed here, this is what the whole book is about. So when the but you what you had in this response to October 7th, this, like, explosion of anti-Israel, anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic sentiment from the leftist elites, what you had from these organizations, like, the idea was what they said was, "Hold up, guys, you put us on the wrong side of the binary. Like, we're oppressed too. Like, what you got it wrong, you got it wrong. You got your bean counting wrong. Like, put us with the black students, put us with the trans. Like, we don't belong with the white people. We don't belong with the Christians. We don't belong with the conservatives." Because that's what they were getting is the conservative white Christian treatment. And to me, this is just like it's not just a betrayal of the people in America who have our backs, which is conservatives, working class Americans, Christian Americans, but it's a betrayal of American history because it is to say we are oppressed, we have been oppressed. It is to assume a worldview that is just a complete and utter misreading of American Jewish history. And I just felt this very deep urge to correct the record on that front.
Yes, and the book does that incredibly well. It brings to light so many things I was not aware of. And I did want to ask you about the oppression question, because to lots of European listeners, it will sound unusual to hear that there was this country that came into existence in the late 1700s, in which Jews were not oppressed, because the history of Europe is, one form of Jewish oppression after another. Sadly, I'm speaking to you from the country in which the blood libel was born in the 1100s, and various things that we don't have to go into have happened since then. Um, and you're saying that was not the case in the United States. Is that because this is a nation that was born from Enlightenment ideals, democratic ideals, rather than having gone through that kind of medieval period where lots of the forms of Jew hatred we know today were first born here in Europe? Explain to us why it was that Jews had a different experience in the United States.
So there's a number of reasons for it. There's the more spiritual reason and then the more, I guess, sociological reason. The spiritual reason is that the founding fathers believed they had a covenant with God, and that covenant um, was very much built out of ideas they believed were in the Torah. The idea that our rights are not a gift from a government and not a gift of our tolerant neighbors, but were imbued in us by our creators. They really believed that. And when Jews started showing up, they saw us as the living, walking, breathing embodiment of the source material of the civilization they were trying to build here. It's a very deep thing, and because so many people who are telling these stories don't have this, they're not religious, they don't have this concept of what it might be to be bound by God, to protect the liberty of your neighbor. It's very hard for them to understand this, but that was the covenant. This was the promised land. And so much of what they were trying to do here, they saw as a reprisal of Jewish history. And so Jews were completely welcome and precious to them when they started arriving. There's also the fact that, if your God has instructed you to protect the religious liberty of your neighbor, you have to have a neighbor who has a different religion in order to make good on that promise, right? So Jews were really the proof of concept in a way that the Catholics and Mormons were not. Catholics and Mormons were oppressed much longer in America because they were seen as kind of the wrong version of Christianity, and they were very alienating to the Protestant Puritan mainstream found a lot of the ideas in those versions of Christianity to be very alienating, specifically the obedience to the Vatican that was seen to them as kind of anathema to what it meant to be an American, which was to be free. Um, and then, of course, there's the sociological reason, which is that a lot of the things that had been stereotypes that had dogged the Jews in Europe, negative stereotypes, were seen as, like, really good things here. So, for example, that they were good with money. You have letters of the founding fathers writing to each other being like, "My God, these people, you give them a penny, you come back tomorrow, there's 2 pennies. Where do we get more of them?" Like, they thought that this was a great quality to have, that they were entrepreneurial and capitalist, and, they worked hard, but they were also upwardly mobile. They didn't they were kind of, a thorn in the side of order. They would they were very litigious. They would take officials to court and sue them for insulting them, and the other Americans would look at this and be like, "My God, they're so litigious. This is great. Where do we get more of them?" Like, this was they were sort of teaching Americans what it meant to be an American, which is to be extremely zealous of your rights, of your property, to be protective of that stuff, which, by the way, big theme in the Bible. Big theme in the Bible, property rights. So, for all of these reasons, stuff that in Europe had been an affront to the elites, here was considered to be, wow, you are teaching us what we could be here. So much of what America wanted to build its culture and its civilization on were things that Jews embodied for the early Americans, for the founding fathers, and for their Christian neighbors.
Yeah, it's so fascinating reading that part of the book and just the different experience and the different valuation given to Jewish communities depending on the culture of the nation is really, really interesting and tells us a lot about what's happening today, which I want to come on to in a moment. Um, Tell us a little bit about the founding of America and the role that Jews played in relation to that. I know that you write in the book about one of the little known Jewish founding fathers and also about George Washington's attitude towards Jews, which may not be as people might have expected it to be. Again, I'm saying that from a European perspective, so everything's colored by that kind of history. In relation to the founding of the US and the values that underpin it, did the Jews play a role there as well?
I think they did, yes. I mean, they were very foundational at every stage in which, like, the nation insisted upon itself, right? So they were big financiers of the revolution. Chaim Solomon was one of the second largest financier of the American Revolution. There would have been no revolution without him. And you have these lovely letters that Madison would write. Who would he would write, I had to go to my friend, the Jew, Chaim Solomon, again to ask for money. And he says, I loathe to go to him because he refuses all recompense. And indeed, Chaim Solomon died 10 years later, utterly penniless because he never got any of the money back. So they fought on both sides of the Civil War, many more in the Union, but they would meet on the battlefield. Families would meet on the battlefield on either side of the Civil War. They were just foundational and fundamental to every stage, and they were never seen as other. And I think it's this that's very hard for Europeans to understand is American Christians are the only population in human history to organize their religion around the protection of Jews rather than their persecution. It's just like an utterly, utterly unique phenomenon that has been totally erased from history. Um, Even today, in my book, which is about left-wing anti-Semitism, there's still a difference between the global left, the European left, and the American left. The American left, they have turned on Jews, they've turned on Israel, but largely what they're doing is giving Jews the treatment they gave whites and conservatives and Christians. They do not hate Jews more than they hate white Americans. They do not hate them more than they hate Christians, and they do not hate Israel more than they hate America. And so for these reasons, it's so upsetting to me when I see Jews saying like, but we are like, when I see them uh, becoming anti-Zionist to curry favor with the side that hates us, smearing the side that stands by us, calling MAGA people Nazis, calling Trump Hitler. Like, this is the side that's got our back, that marginalized, utterly marginalized Nick Fuentes, Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, Alex Jones, who said, Megyn Kelly, you're not in MAGA anymore if you're going to talk that way about Jews. Like, it's just so incredible. We all just saw this happen over the last 6 months, and to me, it's physically painful, to see you have a guy running for Jewish guy, Brad Lander, running for a congressional seat in New York, the 13th, who said to the New York Times, "Yeah, I get queasy when I have to talk about AIPAC because I have to use anti-Semitic tropes about Jewish money and power, but what can I do? I have to do it if I want to win." It's a very light paraphrase of what he said. A Jewish politician, like, it just makes your stomach churn. Why are you on your knees begging for love from people who hate you and smearing the people who love us? But yes, that foundational story is so important to reclaim, because there was never an America without Jews. We got here in 1654, and the first thing an official tried to do, Peter Stuyvesant, was kick us out. And the Jews took him to court and won. Like, it's just an utterly miraculous thing, and it's still ongoing to this day. And I just desperately want people to understand this.
That's why your book is so important. I mean, there are so many histories of the Jews in Europe. I've read many of them myself, but there are untold numbers of books about the history of Jews in Europe, but fewer, I would say, about the history of Jews in America and the foundational nature of it, as you outline in your book. Um, just to stick with history for a little bit longer, do you think it was explain to us a little bit about why in the 20th century Jews were so well aligned with what we would call liberal causes. I mean, the civil rights movement, for example. In fact, a few years ago, when the Borat movies came out, the Christian Science Monitor sent me to Cambridge University to look up Sacha Baron Cohen's thesis that he wrote when he was a student there. And his whole thesis is about how Jews aligned with the civil rights movement and went on down south and registered people to vote. Really good thesis, I must say. Tell us a bit about why you think Jews were central to those kind of early 20th, mid 20th century causes, which I think people like you and I agree were good things in terms of advancing
Yeah.
equality.
It made a lot of sense. So starting around the turn of the century, the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s, about 2 million, between 1,000,000 2 million Russian Jews fled the pogroms and the May laws. And they came to New York, and the vast majority of them worked in the needle trades. They were horrifically exploited, most of the time by other Jews who had got there 5 years before them, 10 years before them. Like, it was very easy to be upwardly mobile. You could and this would happen to the new Jews. They would come, they would be horribly exploited for 5, 10 years. They'd managed to save a little bit of money, and suddenly they found that they had a sweatshop of their own. So they were very upwardly mobile. But they were, because they were the proletariat, they started the labor movement. They became very convinced that the dignity of labor had to be a major organizing political principle. And what's so amazing is that, to me, the moment that this consciousness arose was in 1912. And I'm going to tell this story because I think it is so unthinkable in Europe, but it is so emblematic of how quickly they became Americans. So there's never been a chief rabbi of America because, flies in the face of the freedoms that we believe to be defining of our culture here. They did try once to have a chief rabbi. They brought in this guy. He was a rock star in Europe. He was one of these, like, it was a great orator, and he was, just completely beloved by the community in Europe. They brought him over here, and it was like an utter disaster and failure. He died penniless. It was very sad. And the Jews felt really guilty about it. And so they came out by the tens of thousands to march in his funeral procession. And as they were passing by a publishing house, some of the guys, the Irish guys working in the publishing house, started to jeer at them and, like, throw buckets of water on them and throw, little spitballs and little pieces of paper at them. And it was like the Jews were they could not believe that this was happening. They started picking up rocks. They broke every single window in the first 2 floors of that factory. They stormed the factory, like, I'm talking Jews in hats and payas and women in wigs, and started brawling with the Irish guys there, beating them up. The cops were called, and the cops arrested the Jews, and the Jew which made it even worse because they were like, "We are the aggrieved party here." But the sound that you heard on the street and in that factory was 50,000 Jews screaming, "What is this, Russia?" Like, We did not cross the ocean to come here and have people jeer at us. And it was like this moment of collective consciousness awakening. It was the moment they realized that they were no longer Jewish Russian refugees. They were American Jews. And by the way, they won. They took the chief of police to court for not understanding that they were the aggrieved parties. They won, and he had to issue a public apology to the Jewish community for not understanding that they were the aggrieved parties. This was the moment that they realized what it meant to be Americans, and so they started forming labor unions. There was a horrific, horrific fire in New York in one of these sweatshops. It was a factory. The doors were all closed. 146 girls died horrifically, jumping out the windows horrifically. Most of them were just Jewish teenagers, teenage girls. And one of the people standing on the street watching these girls jumping from a 10th floor window to their deaths to escape the inferno was Frances Perkins, who would go on to become the Secretary of Labor for FDR. She would write the New Deal. And she would always say the New Deal was born in 1916 on that street as those bodies hit that pavement. Because those Jewish sacrifices, those martyrs on the cause of the dignity of labor, I mean, that is where the 5-day work week started. Just the whole idea that labor must be dignified. This was born of Jews on the Lower East Side in the early 1900s. The problem was, as I said, the Jewish proletariat was a very short-lived affair. So they started the socialist movement in America, but, they quickly realized, like, at some point, there's, like, funny stories in the book about how, like, all of the branches of the Communist Party in America were, like, very wealthy Jewish dentists and, doctors and lawyers who had very radical politics. They were really on the lookout for a political movement that was both pro-labor and pro-capitalism, and that's what they found in the New Deal with FDR. So, it made sense, for the first 25 years to be Democrats. It made sense for the next 10, 15 years because, of course, FDR saved them from the Depression. He fought the Nazis in their view. They had a very rosy view of, like, how attached to the Jews he was, but nevertheless. And then, of course, we get to the Civil Rights Movement. The Edmund Pettus Bridge, the march across the bridge in Selma, in which Dr. King marched next to Rabbi Joshua Heschel, Abraham Joshua Heschel, this was 20 years after the liberation of Auschwitz. Like, Jews had this very strong feeling of, like, they just did it to us and now they're doing it to them. The thing is there's a big misunderstanding, I think. Most American Jews, if you ask them, why was the civil rights movement so precious to American Jews? They will say to you, well, it's because we were oppressed. So we were standing with another oppressed group, like the intersectional idea that, all oppression stems from white supremacy. We're all in it together, Jews and Muslims. The fight against anti-Semitism and the fight against Islamophobia and anti-Black racism is one and the same. First of all, it's a nonsense today. Most violence against Jews is perpetrated by Muslims. But even at the time, it's the exact opposite of how Jews saw it. They saw themselves as having never been oppressed here. And they couldn't stand that they had been given this gift and that their Black neighbors had not. And so they felt that it was their sworn duty as Jews to fight for it, not because they had been oppressed, but because they hadn't been. And again, it's like, you're right, we have this sort of, I think the Holocaust looms so large in the historical memory of Jews that we all feel like we're part of this oppressed minority. And it's very hard to convince American Jews that is not your story. Most American Jews are not descended from Holocaust survivors. They're descended from either those, early Jews, the German Jews, and then the Sephardic Jews who came here in the first 250 years, who were always considered to be full American citizens, or from, those immigrants from Russia who came in the 1900s, who built the labor movement and insisted on their rights as workers. So that story is not ours. And to me, it's a little bit of a betrayal of this country to try to assume a story of oppression when it's not ours.
Yes, it's a point so well made in the book as well. And I wanted to ask you, well, before I get onto the oppression question, which I think is fascinating, let's talk a little bit about why the Jews were Democrats, which I think you've explained, and why they still are Democrats, which the bigger question mark over that. So give us a sense of how many Jews are Democrats? What is the kind of voting breakdown? And has it changed at all over the years? And do you see it collapsing at some point in the future? Tell us about the relationship with Democrats specifically.
So about two-thirds of American Jews are still Democrats. Trump did win a record number since Reagan in 2024. The number's like 35%. So there's not much movement. There's all people always think there's gonna be a big Jexit from um, the Democratic Party. I don't really see it happening, with the caveat if the Republicans run Marco Rubio, he's extremely popular, not just with, American Jews who are Democrats, but with a lot of Democrats. I mean, I know a lot of Democrats who would vote for him. I think he could get a kind of Reagan-like coalition. He's seen as, um, a centrist and very competent and just somebody who has very strongly held beliefs. So I know a lot of Democrats and a lot of Jewish Democrats who would vote for him very happily, but if it's not him, you're not gonna see a big exit, and I think that the reason for that, it is very mysterious, is very strange because it's very obvious that the Democratic Party doesn't want them. I mean, it wants to win, but um, the reason for that is that they are now part of the milieu, the socioeconomic milieu that votes for Democrats, and that is a very powerful, powerful thing. They're less voting as Jews and more voting as over-credentialed college elites who live in urban centers, who have convinced themselves that having a national border is some sort of racism, who have convinced themselves that, abortion is the civil rights issue of their time. This I find so hard to understand because most Jews are not broke, they're not poor, we're a very upwardly mobile community, which is like the complete opposite of the profile of the woman in America who gets an abortion. Most Jewish women will never ever need an abortion. But yet, if you talk to Jewish women, even Jewish women who voted for Trump, they'll say to me, "Well, I have 2 top issues, Israel and abortion." And I'm like, how did that how'd you get there? Like, you'll never need abortion, your daughters will never need an abortion." They can't stand this feeling that their daughters have fewer rights than they did. But that's the profile of your average Democrat. And I think that, there's Christians think of Jews as a religion. And Muslims, you have these Muslim politicians like Mamdani, Abdul El-Sayed, and they'll say, "We revere the Jewish faith. We just have a problem with Israel." But the truth is most Jews are not religious. They don't have a relationship with God. Their religion is their spiritual and ethnic connection to other Jews. And to the extent that they don't have that, there's not much left of a Jewish identity that would be recognizable. There's a very strong claim on the Jewish past. Um, but so I think that there's just the socioeconomic question is very, very central. It is the defining feature of American life today, political life. The well-off are Democrats and the working class are Republicans. And if you have that college degree, you've been exposed to that woke mind virus for 4 years, if you have a graduate degree, for 8 years, for 12 years, and 60% of American Jews are college educated. So I think to me, at the end of the day, it's an overdetermined phenomenon, but, a lot of Jews are very convinced that anti-Semitism is worse on the right. That's just not true anymore, but it was for a long time. I mean, that I have to admit and grant them that. It was for a very long time, but it's not anymore. And it's very hard, I think, for them to let go of that.
So Trump sometimes gets into trouble when he says, "Why the hell are Jews voting for the Democrats?"
Yeah.
Is that something you would say as well?
Yeah, I think it's totally it shows how embedded in the community he is. Like, it shows how frequently he's talking to Jews because, he doesn't feel like he has to hide what he really thinks about it, and trust me, that's what Jews say at their own Shabbat tables, right? Like, the 35% who are not voting for Democrats, even a lot of them who are, they sound exactly like that. When I was woke, I used to think that was, like, a horrendous thing to say, but it's obviously, like, a very true thing to say, and we don't wanna say, like, you can't say true things, right?
Yeah. In terms of whether or how things might change, you mentioned Zohran Mamdani. I've been watching his rise with a bit of alarm, I must say, even though we've had similar dynamics in parts of Europe where you have the rise of these kinds of, I guess, a third worldist politics, a kind of Islamist leaning politics. We've seen that in Europe as well. I know it's worried a lot of Jews in New York, but I presume a lot of Jews in New York also voted for him. But do you think that phenomenon will change how the Jews view the Democrats, especially if the Mamdani wing of the party becomes more influential?
He got 30% of the Jewish vote, which is very little, very little. Like, for the Democrat running for mayor in New York City, I don't see him as an Islamist. To me, he's indistinguishable from, like, the other sort of progressive, college-educated, nepo baby elites. Like, to me, it's kind of cosplay, his whole, like, Muslim identity. His wife's obviously not religious, she doesn't cover her hair, she doesn't dress modestly, his mother's Hindu. Um, so to me, it's almost like he's Muslim in the way that the, like, as a Jew, Jews are Jewish, right? Like, it's convenient. It's there to make, um, white progressives feel good, feel better about themselves, feel like they're, doing some epic heroic feat by supporting you. It's so different from the Islamism in Europe, in my mind. Europeans get upset when I say this, but, it's just so different. Like, the Muslims who move here tend to be middle class, and they tend to be upwardly mobile, they want in on the American dream, which has a very moderating effect. So you don't really see communities here where, like, the grandmother was secular and the daughters are now suddenly wearing a niqab, which I've been told you see in Europe a lot and in the UK. Like, that's a disaster. I don't think we have that, and, there are certainly neighborhoods where you have, like, a preponderance of, like, the Somali community in Minnesota, Minneapolis, but, like, if you look at the crimes they were committing, they're all, like, white collar crimes, like, it's just fraud, it's not like it's a no-go zone where, like, girls are being raped by gangs. So I think that it's just really different, and again, like, there's something in this soil that it just really rejects Jew hate, but also I think a kind of religious extremism, probably because of the way that we treat religion here, that covenant with God, and so forth. So I think it's very different. It could be a question of, like, quantity, but, I do think that because the Muslims who come here, because it's so much more expensive to get here than it is to get to Europe, it's just a very different type of, community.
Yeah, I feel that when I go to the US and I'm in a community with a heavy number of Muslims, I feel that it is different to parts of the UK and Europe where there are large Muslim communities, which are often much more ghettoized, much more cut off from the mainstream of society, much less likely to feel British and all those kinds of problems. Um, I wanted to ask you about left wing anti Semitism. That's what your book is about as well. And you say that it's now worse on the left than it is on the right. And I think that's probably true of the UK as well. Although we do have a return of right wing Semitism, it's very palpable. But I think it's probably worse on the left here as well. Um, Explain to us what you understand left wing anti Semitism to be. What forms does it take? What are the ideas that underpin it, do you think?
I would say it's a hostility to Jewish interests and Jewish power. So it's the view that, Jews have too much power, and basically wherever you can, you should try to minimize their access to power. Um, and again, it stems from a hatred of power itself, a hatred of strength, the belief that, the more powerful are inherently evil. In America, we racialize everything. So if you have white skin, you're, part of that by definition. There is like a unique kind of like disgust and distaste that they have for Israel that came out after October 7th. I don't want to minimize that at all, but I just don't feel that they hate Jews significantly more than they hate white Christians, conservatives, MAGA people, Trump. In fact, a friend of mine recently said to me, "You think that they hate Trump because he's pro-Israel, but they are actually turning on Israel because it's pro-Trump." Like, Trump is really, he's such a totalizing figure, the only real metric in American political life. Um, so again, you'll have people like Mamdani who insist that they have no problem with the Jewish faith. It's just Jewish political power, Jewish strength, right? Jewish sovereignty that they have a problem with, all of which are often embodied by Zionism in Israel, and Zionism being like basically the religion of most Jews worldwide because they don't have they're not religious people. Um, so that's what it is. It's sometimes I think, is it even right to call it anti-Semitism? Well, it is. Like, they don't think they're bigoted against Jews. But this desire to reduce the power and the standing and the sovereignty and the strength of a specific minority is inherently anti-Semitic. Now, the thing that I think is really important to emphasize is that doesn't mean we're oppressed. A bunch of college know-nothing nincompoops marching on a college campus chanting genocidal things about Jews is not oppression. Like yeah, Jewish students are going to be unpopular with their sociopathic peers. That is not like an inherently bad thing. Oppression is when the state is sponsoring and underwriting a different treatment of a minority. And it's like the exact opposite in America, certainly under the Trump administration. They've been very protective of Jewish interests and fighting anti Semitism. So we're not oppressed. We're not an oppressed minority just because one side of the political aisle has an elite that has turned hostile to our people and our interests. And I think this is so important to point out. You can have just garden variety anti Jewish sentiment, like garden variety racism against Jews, that doesn't make us oppressed because we have all of the power in the world to fight against it. We have all the agency we need to fight against it. And so I see so many American Jews just sort of like throwing in the towel, talking about moving to Israel. I'm like, are you kidding me? Because of a bunch of sociopathic 18-year-olds? You're going to throw in the towel on your homeland? Like, that to me is just insane.
I wanted to ask you about anti-Zionism and the role that that plays, because I heard you recently making a distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And of course, there are lots of differences, but maybe this is different in the US as well. But in Europe, increasingly, the form that anti-Zionism takes is as its own ideology of hatred, and it rehabilitates a lot of the things people used to say about the Jews. It demonizes the Jewish state as uniquely evil, and the people who support it as uniquely evil. That's why we've have protests now outside synagogues in the UK because people see Zionists as a particularly problematic section of society. What role do you think anti-Zionism plays in this? Do you think there are legitimate forms of anti-Zionism and illegitimate forms? How do you see it?
Yeah, I definitely do. I am blessed by having a very close friend who's Palestinian and lives in the West Bank under Israeli occupation. He's not a Zionist, and I think it's a bit of a chutzpah to ask him to be one, because the state of Israel came at his expense. Like, so I can't, I could pretend I don't know him, but I don't know that that would make me that would just make me dishonest, right? I know people who have legitimate grievances against the state of Israel and its existence, and I don't hold it against them, because we have all the power in that situation, and so it just makes no sense. A random white person in the UK, like in Birmingham, deciding that this is their one cause that they're going to live and die on, that Israel is the source of all the world's evil. That guy is an anti-Semite, you know. So I do think that there are, like, it is philosophically possible to be against the state of Israel and not to be an anti-Semite. But those examples are very few and far between. I think most people, you saying to the Jews, you uniquely cannot have a nation state on planet Earth, a single one on your ancestral homeland. It's going to take a lot to convince me that you don't have a unique problem with Jews in order to arrive at that conclusion. But you've done such an amazing job explaining how, like, the genocide allegation is basically just oppression envy, it's Holocaust envy. They took the crime that was perpetrated against the Jews and laid it at the feet of the Jews so that Europe no longer had to feel guilty about what it did to its Jewish population. Like, that is your gift to the world, that understanding that. And that is so true. And that is such a deeply anti-Semitic thing to do and to think. Um, but I do know people who are either of Palestinian descent, or they feel that, America shouldn't exist. They feel that no nation state should exist. Is their anti-Zionism a reflection of a unique anti-Jewish sentiment? I don't think so, because, like, they don't think America should have a border or is entitled to a border. So, and I think it is important to have as capacious a view of legitimate discourse as Americans, just because our country is founded on the free exchange of ideas. So to me, it's like, it's very easy to just be like, yeah, all anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. I'm not talking to anybody who believes Israel doesn't have a right to exist. But to me, like, I continue to think, if we can, we should find a way to have the most amount of conversations possible And sadly, like, there are people who over the last 2 years went from being in the category for me of, like, legitimate criticism to the category of, like, "Oh, you just hate the Jews," and it's sad to see that happen in real time on social media. Their brains just get rotted. So I've been made, to look like a bit of a fool on this exact question many times, but, I just think, like, as Americans, we have to have, like, as big of a "we" as possible, um, especially on these difficult issues.
You talked about oppression envy, Holocaust envy, and I wrote about that in my book. And it reminded me, I wanted to ask you about the kind of reverse of that, I guess, which Jews in America, as you've already mentioned, wanting to be oppressed or coveting the category of oppression. We really saw that with the campus protests around after 7th of October. Jewish kids on campus feeling incredibly isolated, incredibly let down in some cases by their own campus administrations. And I was so interested in the response because a lot of the coverage was saying, why don't Jews have a safe space? Why don't they have access to these sacred spaces in which you're not allowed to be abused or shouted at or disagreed with? And they were almost desiring to have the same kind of infrastructure of infantilization that other students have by virtue of their status. Um, and that struck me as just so wrong. And in fact, entirely the wrong way to approach the problems that did exist on campus. Are you still seeing that now? Are you still seeing a situation where, maybe understandably, Jews who feel besieged are saying, please stop, we're oppressed like those other groups?
I think it's a lot less now. The activism is a lot less now. The universities really crack down on it, which is wonderful, is what happens when you're not an oppressed minority is the government says you're not getting your money unless you stop doing this, and then they stop doing it, right? Like, so I'm seeing a lot less of it. Sometimes you would see like, I would love to see, like, in LA when you would have, I shouldn't say this, but, when you would have, like, the anti-Zionists or anti-Semites would show up outside a synagogue, and then a bunch of Persian Jewish thugs would show up and start giving as good as they got, like, I love a brawl, like, and I just like, more of that, please. Not obviously, I don't condone any violence or anything, but, like, just an understanding of who we are and what we are, and that these are a bunch of, like, cowards who only show up places, in big crowds because they can't actually, answer for their views and are not willing to actually have conversations about them. I do feel for the students. I've been protested at universities. It is horrifying, and it's horrifying when you try to talk to people and they won't look at you like a human, like, which is what happened to me, like, you feel like you're in a zombie movie because you're trying to say, "Look, talk to me. I'm standing in front of you as a human being, as a fellow American," and they, like, are looking past you like they've been zombified. It's kind of like it does send a chill through your heart, but, it's so important that we not cave and tell Jewish students that they're, like, unsafe in some way as if these, like, know nothings are gonna start punching them. They never would. They're like, it's like they're all they thems. You know what I mean? Like, they're not gonna, like, start brawling with, like, Jewish students. It's not gonna happen.
I really agree with that. Yeah. I don't think you don't have to be scared of they thems, these kind of, they don't even eat meat, they're not the strongest people. Um, yeah, and actually what you just said really rings true with me because there was a protest in outside the synagogue in Edgware, which is in Northwest London, which is the area I grew up in. There was a protest at a synagogue there just this past weekend. Um, and the Jews of the local area turned up. They outnumbered the protesters hugely. They were singing and dancing and waving the Israel flag and the British flag because they feel very British. And I thought that's the way to do it. You just outnumber them, you embarrass them with joy and dissent, and that's the way to do it. You don't say, "We're oppressed, please leave us alone." Um, I wanted to ask you about a recent scandal in the US. Well, maybe it's not as big a scandal as it should be, but the Democrat Graham Platner with his infamous tattoo. I gather it's basically a Nazi tattoo, but can you just explain to us a little bit about who he is and what this tattoo is and what people are saying about this?
So the backstory is the Democrats lost the working class and they lost men big time to Trump, and so they're always on the lookout for they're sort of out there headhunting candidates who look like they could fit the bill to bring men back and working class people back. So these two very elite DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, organizers went out into Maine to try to find somebody like this who could fight Susan Collins. And they found this guy, Graham Platner, who had done 4 tours of duty, although I think only 2 of them were with the United States military. He worked for Blackwater, which is just incredible. Like, Blackwater was like the bête noire of the left when I was coming up. It was like the word you didn't say, like Voldemort, you know? Anyway, this guy, all right, they see this guy, he's wearing flannel, he's got a bunch of tattoos on his arms, he's got a gravelly voice and a mustache. He has an oyster farm, although it doesn't make any money. He sells the oysters to his mother's restaurant, and it exists on the private island of a very wealthy friend. It made $6,000 last year, so it's not like it's a hobby basically, but
Yeah.
they start portraying him as, an oyster farmer, from Maine, a man of the people, even though he went to like a very fancy university, his father bought him his home and gave him $200,000 down payment, whatever. All right. He looks the part, and so they start trotting him out. He hits the campaign trail, does very well. People, I think, mostly middle-aged women who love a fixer-upper, start really rallying around him. And then the scandals start to break. So he had a bunch of Reddits in which he said racist things about Black people, in which he suggested that women who get raped need to take responsibility for themselves. It turns out that he was on an app, a sexting app, for which is known as the Predator's Paradise, where he was sexting with up to 12 women who were not his wife for the entirety of their marriage, which is only 3 years old. All of these things are coming out, and of course, the big thing that came out was that he had a Totenkopf tattoo on his chest, which is it's not just that it's a Nazi symbol, it is the insignia of the SS who were charged with being concentration camp guards. So the last thing that millions of Jews saw before being shoved into a gas chamber, including my great-grandparents, he chose to have tattooed on his chest. Now, it came out during the campaign, and he insisted he had no idea what it was. He's had it for 18 years. But, a lot of acquaintances who knew him at this point, I think it's like 4 people, said he referred to it as his Totenkopf, his Nazi tattoo. He knew what it was. And he kept it for 18 years, and then during the campaign, he made this whole, "I don't want this on me," and so he covered it up with another tattoo, although you can still see the crossbones sticking out of the second tattoo he got on the first tattoo. There's more coming out. He roughed up one of his girlfriends, locked her in a room, shoved her arm up behind her, left bruises on her. She's a Republican, and so the Democrats dismissed her. Then another one came forward and said that he used her to cheat on his fiancée. He's basically never been in a relationship he hasn't cheated on. Okay, so this is the Democrats' candidate, and what's amazing is they're all lining up behind him, and every week a worse scandal breaks, and they have to defend a worse thing. Like I keep saying, it's kind of like a game show. How low will they go? And then there's the whole sunk cost fallacy, right? Once they defended beating up his girlfriend, like, well, what are they not going to defend a Nazi tattoo? But what's so amazing to me is that like this basically like revealed they never believed their Me Too BS. They never believed it when they called Trump a Nazi. They never believed it when they said he's a pedo protector, whatever, because they are backing a guy who has done all those things and worse. And I never thought I would see the day that they would literally relinquish the moral high ground. Because how are they ever going to accuse anybody on the right of being a Nazi anymore when their guy has a literal Nazi tattoo? So in a way, I think it's great. Like, it's great because it revealed who they really were. And of course, relevant to my book and the argument I make, the 2 top Jews in American political life, Chuck Schumer and Bernie Sanders, are backing him very happily. Bernie Sanders, who spent I remember I pulled a video from 2016, 2020, talking about how his family was all killed in the Holocaust. And so he knows from anti-Semitism. And now he's happily backing a guy who for 18 years, every time he got out the shower, he saw a Totenkopf tattoo and he knew what it was.
I think it's a good thing that this has happened, like you, because it completely shatters any chance that they can play the Nazi card again against Trump. I mean, that's over now, and unless they want to be called hypocrites by people like you, which I'm sure they will be. Um, what do you think it tells us about the Democrats' relationship with the working classes, especially what they view as working class men? I mean, it suggests to me that they are just so unbelievably out of touch with how actual working men think and behave. That's what it seems to me.
And what's so amazing is after all the scandals broke, you'll see Democrats saying, Graham Platner is what a working class person's life looks like. Like they get into fights with their women. They get tattoos that they shouldn't. Like there was this one leftist guy. I joke because it's like all of these men who basically look like human pocket protectors are out here being like, this is real masculinity, like, no, this is just scumbag. Like, this is just, abuse. Like, this is just gross. And to act like this is what working class life is like is such an offense to the very people they're pretending to defend. And it's almost like there's these two models of masculinity being held up, like the Democrats model, which is, as you say, from people who haven't met a real man in decades, who don't know what working class life is like, who think that this man who's cosplaying as a working class man, who's just a walking scumbag, like this is what it really is, like one guy said, Graham Platner is an affront to HR ladies. Like, is it or they say Democratic voters want someone who's not grown in a vat. So it's like, so my choices are vat
Yeah.
or like Nazi who beat up his girlfriend? Like, it's like,
Wow.
no. On the right, I think people look at him and they say, like, this is not masculinity. Like, to be a man is to be in control of your faculties, is to control your power and your strength. It's to show up, for your woman and your children. It's to defend the vulnerable. It's to understand your obligations to society, all of which Graham Plattner stands in like direct opposition to.
Okay, Batya, I've got one more question for you. Before I ask it, everyone should read your book if they want any more in-depth coverage of the things you've just been talking about. It's an essential read to understand modern America, the Jewish situation, everything else. So people really should get it. But my last question for you, just about you famously call yourself a MAGA leftist. You get in a lot of trouble for calling yourself a MAGA leftist. I wanted to just finish by asking you how you think Trump is doing. I know you're a fangirl of Trump. We've spoke about it when we met in New York a couple of years ago. Um, do you think it's going well? Are there any wobbles in your convictions? How do you think it's going right now?
The first year was incredible, like, incredible. Every day he did, like, exactly what I would have done, like, from the tariffs to the Venezuela to the deportations to the Israel deal in Gaza with the hostages, and, right now, I'm very worried about what's in the deal with Iran.
Mhm. Yeah.
I'm very upset about how broke working class people are right now. I think he should send people a stimulus check from the tariff, revenue. Uh, so right now, things are not great. Like, I supported the goal in Iran, but I'm very worried that he's gonna get out with a bad deal, and that will be the end of his legacy and the end of the second term because he'll spend the next 2 years defending having torn up the JCPOA and then gotten something either worse or just as the same. Like, it's gotta have been worth it, the 3 months of real pain for working class people. Um, so I'm very curious to see what's in that deal, and, if they commit to the nuclear stuff and there's real verification with teeth, I'll be very happy. I'll feel that, he did an incredible thing, and I will be, annoyed at the Israelis. It's just too soon to tell, but I'm very worried that the deal is not good, and, then there will be a big bump in the road. Not just because of the deal, but because of the cost, which was borne by the working class, and I'm very upset about that.
Batcha, thank you very much.